That suspension is so comfortable. It's such a give when he goes down.
Damn, it's cold out.
Oh, it's freezing.
It's about time we tear it all apart and build that motor. We're back. Now we got the bike inside after we pulled some wheelies outside. I almost looped it. Dylan almost looped it. I wish I saw Dylan almost loop it because Danny said it was something to see. But now we're going to start pulling it apart. We just ran the bike on Galaxy gas. If you want to see this bike on Nitrous, 1.7 miles, I hope it doesn't void the warranty. But we're going to, if you want to see that short, it's going to be posted before this video comes out. But without further ado, after running this bike on Nitrous, we're going to tear the motor apart and get it ready for a turbocharger. So we're tearing it apart now. We got the plastics all off, got the airbox out. Now with this turbo kit, I'm going to try to replicate the stock airbox in almost every sense. I'm going to try to get rid of this kind of snout right here and make it a bigger volume right in front of the throttle body. But we have plenty of room to play with. We're going to try to pull off the top end in the frame. I might be able to pull everything out from the top. If you want to zoom in right here, there is a good amount of room to work with. I think if I tilt the valve cover and tilt the head and the cylinder and stuff, I might be able to pull it all out of the top here. But if not, I'm going to tilt the engine forward and do it that way. But coming right up, we'll have it all torn apart and we'll show you guys what we're going to do to this engine. All right, so me and the boys are just wrapping up right now. We got the head and the cylinder off the bike. I'm surprised at how beefy this cylinder is. The wall thickness is really thick compared to like the 450s or some of the other gases I've taken apart. This is a really good block, and I think it's going to be able to hold all the power. Here's our twin spark head. It's got 2 spark plugs, which is going to give us a more efficient combustion, and it all looks really good. I mean, obviously this is a brand new running bike, but here we have it all torn apart. I decided to see if we can go ahead and do all this inside of the chassis. It's really a pain in the ass to pull this engine apart because the swing arm, this swing arm bolt goes through the swing arm as well as the engine. So in order to really pull the engine out, I'd have to pull the whole swing arm out, which would end up with this bike being pretty much completely dismantled. So in order to try to avoid that, we went ahead and pulled everything off in the chassis, and I pulled the head and the cylinder out from the top, and we're going to try to feed it back in through the top with the cylinder studs that we have in place. But that's a problem for another day. We're going to call it a night at this point. And yeah, stay tuned. I'm going to continue this tomorrow. Waiting on the cylinder stud still. But this is going to be one hell of a build. See you guys in a minute. Alright, it's many days later. We're back at the messy shop. And we have the gas all laid out here. So I think I mentioned earlier that I wanted to get rid of these engine bolts and instead run engine studs. Now, I called my contact over at APE, and they had something off the shelf that was going to work. These APE GS11 or CS1150S, but yeah, for all Suzuki 1100 models. But the problem with these studs is they actually don't have as much threads going into the cases as the bolts do, and that's really the main spot where these studs end up letting go is the aluminum side, because this is all steel. The bolt's steel. You know, if you had a nut up top, that would be steel as well. So what's going to give out is the threads in the cases. So unfortunately, the studs I ordered, the threads going into the cases aren't as long as the bolts. Now, since that's our main concern, I'm actually going to end up still running these stock bolts. I could go out of my way to order some more studs that have, you know, even more threads than those bolts probably. But I'm just going to stick with the bolts. We're really not going to push this engine, you know, too far beyond its limits. We're going to run like 7 pounds of boost again. I'm sure the original studs are going to be completely fine, or the original bolts rather. The Gasgas 450 dirt bike that I built, we really plan to go all out with that eventually and maybe make like 20, 30 pounds of boost with it. You know, make 150 horsepower or something crazy. So I was really adamant about the studs being in there, but based on the direction, I think it'd be kind of it would be crazy to go out of my way and spend even more money for these engine studs when I don't think we're limits to the stock bolts. So I'm going to run the stock bolts. Now, going on to the gaskets, I'm getting ready to assemble this all back together right now. So, one thing I just did is this head right here has this little port right here, and from the factory it has this little resonating box, and this box would just clip right in. Sorry, it's all messy, ill-prepared. So it has this port with an O-ring, and traditionally that would go on the side of my head, just like that right there, and it would bolt right into the side of the head, just like that. I'm going to ditch this whole resonating box setup because I really don't know if this box is able to hold up to boost. So what I went ahead and did is actually tapped that hole right here for an M8 by 125 bolt, and I put a copper washer underneath the head of this bolt right here, and I just sunk that bolt in. So that's how I'm going to get rid of this intake resonating box. And I'm also going to do the same thing on the exhaust side. So the exhaust side, normally if we tip the head over, again, sorry for the mess, we're trying to work quick. It has this one-way exhaust valve, and you could see the port actually casted into the head. It goes along this channel here and ends up being a hole in the exhaust port right up top right there. You can see right there, you can see there's a machine port that feeds from the exhaust, goes down this channel into this box where this actually has the one-way valve, which is right here. So this would allow air to come into it, but not exhaust to actually go back out. And we're going to end up ditching this. Rottweiler sells a block-off plate, so to actually make the head easier to install into the chassis, the bike over there, I'm going to go ahead and just remove this. And once it's in the bike, once the head's already on and the engine's all back together, you could just install the Rottweiler block-off plate right there, just like that. So the head's done. Something with the Gasgas SM700 that I'm not going to do with this bike is I shim the intake valve springs. And the reason you do that is because when you're putting boost inside of an engine, the boost is like ramming on top of the intake valves, and basically if you run a lot of boost, the boost can actually push your intake valves down and cause them to stay open longer than you want them to. This can end up, causing valve to piston contact, valve float. That's essentially the term for it. But since, again, we're not going to run too crazy a boost on this bike, I'm not even going to go ahead and do that. At 7 pounds of boost, that's not enough boost to hold open your valves any longer. I don't imagine valve float is going to be an issue. And especially with the springs head right here, I didn't measure their spring rate pressure, but they're heavy coil beehive springs. Let's see if I can get good lighting. You can check one of these out. You can see that's a very heavy coil beehive spring with a good retainer on it. So I do not think that's whatsoever. So we're going to treat it like it's not one. Now, what we're going to do before I put this all back together is we're going to lower the compression of the bike. And how I'm doing that is I'm replacing single base gasket right here, which is only 10 thousandths thick, and I'm adding 2 more. So I'm adding 20 thousandths or half of a millimeter onto under the cylinder. So that's going to increase the volume at bottom dead center, but also increase the volume at top dead center and end up lowering our compression. So, this bike makes about 12 to 1 compression out of the box. It's either 12 or 13. That's escaping me. But regardless, this 20, raising the whole cylinder and head by 20 thousandths is gonna, it's gonna lower the compression if you do the math out. So we're gonna drop the compression by 1 point, which is gonna allow us to run that 7 pounds of boost on pump fuel and have no issues. Hopefully, that's the plan so far. But right now, I'm gonna put the base cylinder right here. We're gonna clean the surface with brake clean, make sure it's extremely clean, and I'm gonna stack up my base gaskets and get ready to put the piston back in the bore. Now, one other thing, not to hold you guys all night here, but one other thing is KTM actually usually, they take the piston off, they put the piston in the bore, and then when you're installing it, you actually just put the piston that's already in the cylinder on top, and then install it by using the wrist pin. But that's the proper way to do it. Gasgas SM700 like that, and I probably should have, because the rings are actually extremely hard to get in the bore and these cylinders, and that's the reason that KTM does it that way. But I feel like it's harder. It's harder when you're sitting there and you're trying to hold the piston and cylinder up, and it's really not an ideal setup. So I just do it the old-fashioned way, It's probably not the best way to do it, but without further ado, let's get that installed and then move on to the other mods that we're actually going to end up doing for this build. Base gaskets are now in and installed. These tensioners are really splayed out, and even with the zip tie down here, I zip tied the two tensioners together, pulled the chain tight so that I can get the tensioners as close as possible. And even then, I had to go with my hands and actually like push them together physically to get the gasket over it. It's a really tight fit, but nonetheless, we got all three gaskets in. Now's gonna be the fun part, which is getting the cylinder on. Really, the fun part is getting the rings in the bore, but we'll worry about that in about 30 seconds. Boy, them top ends never get easier on a KTM. Those oil rings are thick and they're nearly impossible to get into the cylinder. But that being said, we got the cylinder all on. You can see our three base gaskets down there. And in this angle, you can kind of see how far below the piston sits. This is top dead center right here. And you can see it's really not much. I mean, most engines you build have an even greater squish than that. But that extra 20 thousandths right there equate to a lot of power at the end of the day at a much safer compression ratio. So now that we got the cylinder on, I'm going to plop the head on, torque it, and what I like to do, this is kind of, I learned this from a lot of top engine builders, but what I do, and this is more pertinent or more important if you're using like paper style gaskets, like something that really compresses, then what you're going to want to do is torque your head to its final torque value. Like go through all the torque sequence, do everything you got to do, and then what you want to do is let it sit for a day, a week, just any amount of time, and then retorque the head. And what you'll notice is, especially if you let it sit a long time, that at least one of your head studs or bolts is going to be loose, and that's really common. Especially like this is on my Gasgas. I really didn't see any. I really didn't lose torque value over time like I did with a lot of other stuff, because it uses a metal style base gasket, metal style head gasket, both multi-layer steel gaskets, so they don't really compress much over time. So on an MLS style, something that's, you know, metal from the block all the way to the top of the head, you might not see any improvement, but that's something I like to do. Even with the MLS, everything this thing has going for it, I'm still going to go ahead and retorque the head probably this weekend. So right down, today is Wednesday night. Figure Friday, something like that, I'll retorque the head and put the cams in and do all that. But yeah, I want to go ahead and put the head on now, torque it for the first time, and then we're going to let it sit, and that's going to be the next clip you guys see, maybe. All right, part 3. I lied. This isn't the last time you guys are going to see me tonight. So I went ahead and got the head on, which is no easy task in the frame right here. I'm glad that I didn't go ahead and actually stud the engine, because there's no way, it's actually impossible if you stud the engine to pull the top end in the frame, because you actually have to tilt the head sideways to get it into these frame rails. The head itself is wider than the frame rails right here. So if I had studded the engine, I wouldn't be able to drop the head on perfectly straight down, so it wouldn't have worked anyway. So the head bolts are the best solution. I'm going to go ahead now and torque this to the factory torque settings from there, and then call it a night. But yeah, stay tuned. We're getting there slowly. Okay, day 3 in this build, I think. 4. Regardless, together we got the cams all timed in. Pull this Allen key off. We got our sight cover back on. Got the crank lock out and the bolt back in. Engine's back in the chassis, everything, cams are timed in correctly. What I'm relieved about this build is, a problem I had with the 450 is when I ran 3 base gaskets, it raised the cylinder so much that it actually made the cam chain really hard to stretch over the cams. Sorry for the excess noise too, that's my heater. But yeah, it made the cam chain very tricky to get on. It was very tight, it was tightly loaded. You didn't even need a cam chain tensioner on the 450 because of how tight the cam chain was on the cams. Like, you could have done away with it if you really had to, but it also made sure that it would never skip a tooth. Now with this setup, there's still plenty of tension. You could even run more base gaskets if you wanted to. I would estimate you could probably run 2 more without having issues. And also my cam timing is still spot on. So you can see the dot right there where the white marking is still lined up with the arrow on the cylinder head. And as well with the balancer shaft. They're still completely lined up perfectly. Something to also consider when you raise your base gaskets a lot, you're actually changing your cam timing, which is something a lot of people don't think about. Because if you think about it, the more you raise it up, your chain's going to be tilted ever so slightly more, and your tensioner is actually going to hit the chain in a different way as well. So once you start getting crazy by raising your cylinders, you actually have to get adjustable camshaft sprockets that you could degree your cams in, so you still have the correct cam timing you would if you didn't have all those spacer plates or gaskets. So that's also something to consider. But since this is still very close, it's still on the money, I wouldn't worry about it. I didn't do that with the 450 either, and we didn't have any issues with cam timing or anything like that. The bike ran just as it should. Now going forward, we're going to go ahead and we're going to get the valve cover back on, get the throttle body back on, and kind of wrap up this engine section. The last thing I have to do is modify the oil pressure relief valve to go ahead and to make more oil pressure. That's the last mod we're going to. Now time for the last mod on this engine. So the last thing we're going to do is shim the oil pressure relief valve, which is behind this plug right here. So I'm going to take a 6mm Allen key and pop off this plug and make a shim for it right now and show you guys how we do that. Okay, so we popped that plug out right there, and with my magnet right here, I went ahead and pulled this spring out. Now on KTM's website or Gasgas's website, they claim this is a 5-bar spring. But after doing research, it seems like the maximum oil pressure when this engine's hot is around 40-something PSI. So what I'm going to do is add this plastic spacer right here. Now, ideally, this would be metal, but this isn't going to, this part's really not going to get worn, essentially. It's going to go on the end of the spring, just like that. And it's going to have a permanent position right there. And even though the spring is going to compress against it, this is actually like a hardened Delrin plastic, so it should never have any issues getting compressed against. It's going to be somewhat like that. And once it's in the hole, it's not really going to go anywhere either. So without further ado, you can look at that spacer and see about how big it is. Again, I'd recommend to make one out of metal, but this is a hardened plastic that I'm very confident is not going to have any issue. So I'm going to go ahead and pop this back in, spring going first with the plastic piece going against the plug. So even if this did deteriorate, the plastic debris would end up on the plug side right here, as opposed to ending up in your engine or plugging up your oil screen. So I'm going to pop this back in, and let's fire this baby up. All right, she's all back together, back in one piece. Now, that being said, the airbox isn't in it, as well as the exhaust. You can see the O2 sensor hanging right there. So fire this baby up and make sure we put it back together correctly. And it's going to sound weird with no exhaust or no airbox or anything like that, but we're still going to fire it up and just verify everything that we did. But without further ado, let's see how it sounds. Let's get around to this side. Flip our key on, switches on. Do I need clutch? Surprisingly, like, it runs actually really well despite no exhaust, no airbox. Half the sensors are unplugged right now because it's missing, it's missing a lot of componentry. But despite that, it fires right up, no issues, sounds great, sounds healthy. Obviously, without the exhaust, it's going to have that burbling sound, but our built engine is done. Calling it a built engine is a little optimistic. This is like just a really massaged stock engine, which is what I like to do. So the next video you see, we're going to start fabbing up the turbo kit. I'm going to walk you guys through that process and explain everything we're going to do to boost this engine. And then part 3 will be tuning it after that. So if you guys want to check that out, stay tuned, hit the like button, subscribe button, and this content is only going to ramp up more. We have a 6-cylinder turbo motorcycle. This is very bare bones right now, but this bike is getting a full restoration. So it's coming up, probably 3 months after this done, we're going to go ahead and Turbo CBX is going to be coming down the pike. So thanks for watching. Have a good night.